Dave, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good morning, everybody. I'm speaking to you today from Boomerang Land down in southern Victoria. And as Scott said, it's always appropriate to acknowledge our country, and it's especially appropriate when we're talking nuclear, as First Nations people here and overseas have borne the disproportionate adverse impact of this sector. Well, June 19, it was an extraordinary day, and it was the latest and most absurd and most irresponsible chapter of the long-running federal culture wars on climate and energy. Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, announced a plan, and I use that word very generously because a plan generally has some detail. He announced a plan and unveiled a nuclear pathway for Australia. Now, I don't want to be too Donald Rumsfeld about this, but we know more about what we don't know about Dutton's nuclear plan than what we do know about their push. We don't know the cost. We don't know the proposed reactor types. We don't know the specific siting details. We don't know the proportion of planned future mix of nuclear energy into a national electricity grid. We don't know the detail of the ownership and operating structures, the regulatory frameworks, impacts of water use and other things. And we especially don't know anything about radioactive waste management. So there's lots of don't knows, but there's some very clear do knows about this plan, which I think is really important. I'm not going to talk in all the technical details of nuclear. I know some of the faces on this call know that backwards, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jim Green, who is expert on that matter. But I want to just talk about the political framework, the consequences, and what's at stake here. And we clearly do know some things about this coalition plan. We know that it's ad hoc, chaotic, contradictory political fix. And it's a political fix that seeks to unite a disparate coalition from techno-enthusiast libs through to renewable-phobic gnats under one policy umbrella. We do know that it seeks to cover up over a decade of climate denial and inaction by the coalition when they had their hands on the levers of government. And that includes a decade of failing to advance nuclear. Suddenly they've embraced it. For a decade, they had all the instruments and they just didn't move forward on it. We know that it's an attempt to wedge Labor, particularly in relation to AUKUS. We know that it's a Trumpian-style attempt to harness legitimate concerns and disaffection about cost of living and site-specific renewable rollout concerns into a voice-style resentment vote with no or limited connection to reality, evidence, or truth, but introducing uncertainty, confusion, doubt, resentment. We know that it is an attempt to cement fossil fuels in Australia's future energy mix. This push is being actively promoted by the Mineral Council of Australia, and the big winner in this push is gas. We also know that the coalition, the self-proclaimed champion of small government, free market, states' rights, is jettisoning all these foundation principles with this policy. In announcing the nuclear plan, the coalition had very little detail, like I said, but they were quick to point out that they were prepared to use Commonwealth override powers to overcome state opposition. They would override community opposition in the national, should be nationals, interest. They would set up a national nuclear authority, effectively nationalising electricity, because the existing electricity generators and transmitters and funders won't touch nuclear. And they would use, and have said explicitly, that they would use compulsory acquisition powers to purchase their preferred sites. They didn't have the courtesy or the common sense to pick up the phone and ring up Alinta and AGL and others and enter into a dialogue. Those utilities found out via a live stream press conference. This is all the hallmarks of a command economy with Peter Dutton as the commander-in-chief. Now, Jim and Mia and other speakers today will detail myths and concerns and impacts. I won't talk too long, but I want to close with just a couple of points. Nuclear is not only demonstrably the slowest and most expensive energy option for Australia, with unique related safety and security impacts, it is also clearly and consciously an active distraction from credible and effective climate action. Now, coal has been the mainstay of Australia's electricity system. And as we know on this call, it's on its way out. Most will be gone in 10 years, all will be gone in 15. So what do we do? How do we replace that? Well, at the moment, renewables are now 35% of our electricity in this country, over a third. Every day is produced by renewables. They're proven, deployable, vastly safer, vastly cheaper. And this nuclear plan is an attempt to interrupt the renewable rollout. And it's not just us like ACF and Friends of the Earth and Don't Nuke the Climate and all sorts of activists saying this. Paul Kelly, editor-in-chief of The Australian, not a card-carrying member of the nuclear-free community, said this absolutely clearly and really belled the cat recently, just last week. And he said that the intended consequence of this policy is to derail the renewable transition. Now, in my perspective, when we're looking at a national government responsibility to keep the lights on, the Geiger counters off, the carbon emissions down, to interrupt the renewable rollout is economic and environmental sabotage. And this crew who toss coal around Parliament now want to cap and scrap our renewable energy future. That's what's at stake here. We are at a T-junction. We are at a T-junction choice. Coal, which has been the mainstay, is on its way out. Everyone agrees, whether they like it or not, everyone accepts that that's how it is. What do we replace it with? We replace it with renewables, elevated, swiftly adopted, responsible and sustainable, or we replace it with fossil fuels under the guise of nuclear. We can't allow that to occur. We have very solid political and institutional support. And if we lived in a world where evidence made the difference, we would have already won this argument. We've got lots of good supporters on this call and elsewhere, lots of good groups and people coming into this space. We've got federal legal prohibitions against nuclear, state legal and policy bans. We've got a market that said no, from the energy generators, the energy transmitters and the energy funders. They're either not convinced or actively opposed. We have clear and compelling evidence why nuclear is the slowest, the dearest, the least fit for purpose option for Australia's energy future. And the evidence is overwhelmingly against nuclear. But we will face in the coming 9 months, whatever it is, till the election, a social media onslaught, a barrage of commentary, a whole range of right-wing and Murdoch press commentariat, all much of it unhinged, much of it untethered, all of it unhelpful. And some will be explicitly and mischievously misinformation. So we have a real role to articulate a clear and consistent critique. And as Scott has said, all of us need to be nuclear-free activists up until the next election. We need to use our networks, our skills, our connections, our courage, our creativity to actually knock this out so that we can get on with the real and complicated and complex challenges of managing an energy transition for an entire nation. But the first step to being able to deal with that is to get rid of all of this myth, misinformation, and mischievous behaviour around nuclear. So I'd really urge us all to be active, engage, support each other, be clear critiques in our community and in those that we connect with, and to be nuclear-free activists ahead of the next election. So thanks very much.
Dave, thanks heaps. And you're welcome to stick around and be an anti-nuclear activist for the rest of your life if you want, but we need this really determined push over the next 9 months because we can see what's happening here. Sabotage is the word, as David said. There's some great buzz already happening in the chat. Just want to encourage you, if you've got questions for Dave or for any of the other speakers, just throw them in the chat now and we'll be scooping those up, and there's going to be a heap of time towards the back half of the session. Our next speaker I would like to introduce is also an old friend, Mia Pepper from Nuke Free WA. She wears a few different hats, works with Nuclear Free WA, the Conservation Council of Western Australia, also the Mineral Policy Institute. She's recently been the co-author of a report called The Road to a Nuclear-Free Future for Western Australia. and also really looking forward to hearing Mia's view from the West, but also facilitates the Don't Nuke the Climate International organisation, which is a network of orgs and networks from all over the globe that are trying to keep nuclear energy out of the global climate agreements and implementation of the Paris Treaty. So we've got a point of view that's at once very grounded in the West, but also reminds us of the global dimensions of what we're up against. Mia, take it away.
Thanks so much, Scott. Hi, everyone. I'm calling in from Vulu, Perth, on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'm really happy to talk a little bit today about uranium mining and the impacts of this latest nuclear debate on the uranium sector. And I wanted to just open by acknowledging some of the elders that we've lost in the uranium fights that we've been fighting for a long time. This week, sadly, we lost Guarda elder Richard Evans, who and his family have been fighting against the Yalira uranium mine in WA for over 50 years. And this quote of his, I think, really touches on the impacts of the whole nuclear cycle, and that it starts here and it starts on the ground with uranium mining, and the concerns and that custodianship that people feel in some of these communities that are faced with uranium mining is that sense of what this stuff can do when it's out in the world. And we know, thanks to some of the great work Scott did when he was in Parliament, that it was Australian uranium that was in each of the reactors of Fukushima when the meltdown happened. And so to bring it back home, to bring it back to some of the threats that are ongoing, whether or not we're talking about nuclear power, is the forever threat of uranium mining in Australia, and that fight we've been fighting for over 50 years. And I also want to acknowledge Uncle Kevin Buzzacott, who sadly passed away at the end of last year after a lifetime fight against the gigantic mine at Olympic Dam, which continues to operate and is one of the only remaining operating uranium mines in Australia. I'm just going to share a different screen now because I want to take everybody to this other really great resource, which is the Australia map, and it shows all the nuclear sites in Australia currently and highlights some of the uranium mines and the uranium exploration projects that are across the country. And with Peter Dutton's nuclear announcement, and that's not in isolation, that's part of some really big conversations and really big push by the nuclear sector globally, and we've seen that through the Don't Nuke the Climate Network in the States, in Europe, through the COP forums. These huge commitments globally around tripling nuclear production and capacity. And what part of what that has meant for the uranium price is that it's skyrocketed to up over $100 a pound. And to put that in perspective, after Fukushima, it's really the uranium price for the best part of a decade has sat around 20 to 30 US a pound. So 100 is a really significant difference and has really changed the conversation around uranium mining in Australia. And it's come back down now. It's around $85 a pound, but that's an incentive price for a lot of these companies to hit go. So currently, uranium mining is constrained to South Australia. The Ranger uranium mine closed in, I think, sorry, Dave, I can't remember, 2021. And they now have this forever task of cleaning and containing the radioactive waste in the tailings dams there and cleaning up that site, which is set to cost over $2 billion. And that, you know, like everything nuclear, it's like add a couple of zeros and a couple of decades. And that's the case at Ranger. But so for the first time in a long time, we've seen new mines or old mines restart. And so last week, I think it was, that Boss at Honeymoon shipped their first container of uranium. And that's really significant because really this industry has been on its way down for the last decade since Fukushima. We've seen the closure, we've seen abandonment of projects, particularly in WA. So to start to see this kind of signal shift in if mothballed mines reopening is significant, and we shouldn't underestimate that. In WA, since the nuclear power debate has kicked off, we've had more and more push from uranium companies, and West Perth is full of them, that, you know, companies that want to mine in Australia, they want to mine in WA, and very, very troubling, they want to mine in Namibia and other parts of Africa. And we've seen the legacy of Australian companies operating in Africa and leaving a terrible legacy, and losing their shareholders a lot of money. But I wanted to just pick up on a good point that Scott kind of kicked off with in his opening about Westinghouse and the influence that Westinghouse has played in Australian politics and the push for nuclear power. It was November last year, Cameco, who's the world's largest uranium company based in Canada, who also have these two deposits here, Kintyre and Yeelirrie, WA's largest uranium deposits and possibly Australia's largest untapped deposits of uranium. So Cameco bought 51% of Brookfield, who own 49% of Westinghouse, which is, you know, one of the companies leading the charge for small modular reactors. So the interests here in Australia are connected deeply between uranium mining companies and the companies that want to develop small modular reactors. But in WA, we've closed the border. These mines have been stopped. Mulga Rock is the only uranium project that is able to advance. The other three projects that were approved under the Liberal government have now been, their approvals have expired and they can't develop those mines. But yeah, as I said before, the Dutton nuclear power push has meant that there's more and more agitation from uranium companies to lift the ban in WA. And the Liberal Party here in WA, while they've acknowledged that nuclear doesn't fit and wouldn't suit Western Australia, it doesn't make sense in Western Australia, they have used it as an opportunity to push to lift the uranium ban. So I'll leave it there. Could talk on uranium and nuclear power for a long time, but thanks for the opportunity to just highlight the significance and the risks in WA in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Mia. That's awesome. And thanks everybody who's throwing questions and ideas into the chat as well. It's really appreciated, and we will come back to the good ones a little bit later. So our next speaker has another anti-nuclear long hauler, been involved in this work for decades, literally. Dr. Jim Green is the National Nuclear Free Campaigner with Friends of the Earth Australia. He's also a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group, former editor of the Nuclear Monitor newsletter published by the World Information Service on Energy and the Nuclear Information Resource Service. We'll throw some of these links in the chat a little bit later because they're both fantastic resources. He's got an honours degree in public health and a doctorate in science and technology studies for his thesis on the debates over the replacement of Australia's nuclear research reactor. And Dr. Jim Green is just going to give us a bit of a run through of the key arguments. Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining in today. And I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna traditional owners here in Adelaide. And there's a lot of detail in this PowerPoint, and I don't have time to go through it all, but my main point is that I would like everyone to download this PowerPoint. You can find the link in the chat, and I'll also give you a website at the end where you can download this PowerPoint. So I'm going to have to race through some of this detail. I think it's really important to understand that nuclear power around the world is in a very sickly state, and it's useful to have some relevant facts at your disposal to make that point to people. One is that nuclear power has fallen from its peak of 17.5% of global electricity generation to just 9.2% now. And renewables have grown to 30.2% and should reach 40% by 2028. And you can see on that graph, renewables have shot up in the past decade and nuclear has gone right down, and that pattern is certain to continue. And there are three main reasons. One is the massive cost reductions for renewables, the massive cost increases for nuclear power, and the fallout from the Fukushima disaster. The coalition's nuclear plan, reactors at 7 closed or soon to be closed coal power sites, so-called small modular reactors in SA and WA, even though these small modular reactors don't exist. large reactors in the eastern states, government funded, could be multiple reactors at some or all of these sites, reactors operating by the mid-2030s, even though that's impossible. And if realised, these reactors might produce 5 to 10% of Australia's electricity demand. And that's worth keeping in mind, because the coalition presents nuclear power as a silver bullet, which is going to solve all of our energy problems. It certainly will do no such thing. Could a coalition government deliver on its nuclear plans? Yes, it could use taxpayer funds. Yes, it could override opposition from state governments. Yes, it could use compulsory acquisition laws to acquire the coal power sites from the current owners. Yes, it could override opposition from local communities and First Nations. Perhaps its biggest headache would be a disruptive Senate, because the coalition government would need to get legislation through the Senate, both to repeal the existing legal ban and also for other legislation to facilitate the introduction of nuclear power. If the coalition was serious about reducing greenhouse emissions through nuclear power, well, nuclear power would slow the transition to low carbon power and make it more expensive and more dangerous. That's a best case scenario, which is not a great scenario at all. But the coalition is not at all serious about reducing greenhouse emissions. On the contrary, they want to completely derail the transition to low carbon power, to prolong the life of coal plants and probably build new coal plants, and to massively increase the use of gas power. And there's plenty of evidence to support those assertions. The coalition plans to abandon the current government's target of 82% renewables by 2030, opposes the government's emissions reductions targets, plans to rip up contracts signed by the Commonwealth in its capacity investment scheme. The Nationals are calling for a moratorium on the rollout of large-scale renewables, and that will probably become formal coalition policy. I say that because the tail is wagging the dog here. If the Nationals want a moratorium on the rollout of large-scale renewables, Peter Dutton is sure to follow. The coalition will withdraw Australia's pledge at the COP28 conference to triple renewable energy and double the rate of energy efficiency by 2030. The coalition would sign Australia up to a COP28 pledge to triple nuclear power by 2050. Matt Canavan says the coalition intends to shut down the Climate Change Authority, and there's plenty more evidence that the coalition is not the least bit serious about reducing greenhouse emissions. And there have been some early attempts to quantify these impacts. Of course, that it all comes with the qualification that we don't really know what the government is planning. But CSIRO says the long development times mean nuclear won't be able to make a meaningful contribution to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Academics say the coalition's nuclear strategy would increase Australia's cumulative emissions to 2050 by at least 1,462 million tonnes. Another analysis, 2.3 billion tonnes of increased emissions. Nuclear could sound the death knell for Australia's decarbonisation efforts, according to a report from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And if you download this PowerPoint, you can just click on all these links to read the reports. And I would certainly encourage people to read that Bloomberg report because it's important. An academic at UTS, Australia's carbon budget may blow out by 40% under the coalition's plan. And it's important to note that there's a lot of internal opposition within the coalition. And the most important aspect of this is that the coalition leaders in the 5 states being targeted for nuclear reactors are either sitting on the fence or they're actively opposing the Dutton coalition plan to introduce nuclear power. Malcolm Turnbull says the nuclear policy is bonkers. I won't go through all these in details. Matt Keane is a very important critic, former New South Wales Deputy Premier and now head of the Climate Change Authority. John Hewson says Dutton is promoting nuclear power on behalf of the large fossil fuel donors. One coalition MP said anonymously that Dutton's policy is madness on steroids. Another says the party rooms are in a panic. Another says the policy is bonkers. What do scientists say? Again, I won't go through this in detail, but there's overwhelming opposition from informed scientists, including Australia's chief scientist, Cathy Foley, former chief scientist, Alan Finkel, another former chief scientist, Robin Batterham, New South Wales chief scientist, Hugh Durant-White, and he's important because he wrote a report for the New South Wales Cabinet, which has been widely quoted. CSIRO says that nuclear power does not provide an economically competitive solution in Australia and could not be deployed within the timeframe required. And strong quotes from the Climate Council, which includes many of Australia's leading climate scientists. Nuclear power is too slow. It would necessitate at least 10 years for a whole range of licensing and planning activities, another 10 years for construction, and another 6.5 years, give or take, to repay the energy and carbon debts from construction. So nuclear couldn't contribute to greenhouse emissions reductions until mid-century. And there are plenty of overseas examples which give the lie to the coalition's claim that nuclear reactors could be operating by the mid-2030s. And former Australian chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, says any call to go directly from coal to nuclear is effectively a call to delay decarbonisation of our electricity system by 20 years. Now, nuclear power is too expensive. Once again, I won't go through these reports in details, but there's a lot of useful information out there. The ACF Power Games report, comparing the cost of large reactors in the UK and the US, and SMR cost estimates with CSIRO's estimates for firmed renewables. Basically, the cost of nuclear power would have to come down by 2/3 to be competitive, and that is not going to happen. To replace all of Australia's coal with nuclear would cost at least $500 billion. An important report prepared for the Clean Energy Council by a consulting firm. Nuclear is up to 6 times more expensive than renewables. A really useful report by academics in the Australian Financial Review. Could I ask everyone to commit this to memory, because this is our best estimate so far. Power bills could rise by $1,000 a year under the coalition's plan. So please memorise that and spread the word. As more detail comes out about the coalition's plan and the funding for it, we'll have more accurate and up-to-date information than that. But at the moment, the best guess is that power bills will rise by $1,000. A useful article by Tim Buckley and Anne-Marie Johnson in the AFR. Dutton's nuclear plant could cost up to $600 billion, anywhere from $116 billion to $600 billion. And the best available cost estimates are from CSIRO's Gen Cost report. And you can see those estimates there. You can download this PowerPoint and read and get the link to the CSIRO report. Suffice it to say that firmed renewables plus storage, is much cheaper than nuclear under any realistic scenario, and that's large-scale nuclear or small modular reactors. Now, we're going to fly through this. Nuclear power and weapons proliferation is a huge issue. It doesn't get nearly enough discussion, but in Australia, for example, we've only had one serious push to develop nuclear power, and that was under Prime Minister John Gorton in the late 1960s, and John Gorton later acknowledged that there was a hidden weapons agenda. And this pattern of nuclear power supporting nuclear weapons can be seen around the world. And the industry now openly acknowledges its contribution to nuclear weapons proliferation, so it's no longer in dispute. Nuclear warfare and climate change, otherwise known as nuclear winter. I'll skip over that for the moment. Military attacks on nuclear plants, another issue which gets far too little attention, especially since there are quite a number of examples around the world, in particular in the Middle East, of conventional military strikes on nuclear plants. most commonly to prevent those nuclear plants being used for weapons proliferation, but also for other reasons. And of course, there's a very topical example of this, which is in the Ukraine at the moment. And, you know, we're just surviving by the skin of our teeth in the Ukraine. It's more luck than good management that there hasn't been a nuclear disaster. Every one of the International Atomic Energy Agency is crucial. 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety have been compromised. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant has lost off-site power 8 times. Every time it loses power, there's an increased risk of a meltdown and an increased risk of a nuclear disaster. It survived those 8 losses of off-site power, but that doesn't mean it's going to survive the 9th or the 10th or the 12th or the 20th. And the most recent problem at Zaporizhzhia is drone strikes. So we'll move on. Nuclear disasters. I won't go through that detail, but as we all know, there's a very small chance of a very catastrophic disaster with nuclear power reactors, the most recent being Fukushima. Nuclear waste. There are no operating repositories anywhere in the world for high-level nuclear waste. There is one deep underground repository for intermediate level waste, and it was subject to an underground explosion in 2014. This is in the United States. Probably the 3rd worst ever nuclear disaster. And again, this is little known. It was the Mayak or Chelyabinsk disaster in the Soviet Union in 1957. And it involved the explosion of liquid high-level nuclear waste. And in Australia, we've got plenty enough nuclear waste problems as it is without adding nuclear power to the mix. That includes contaminated sites at Maulinga, Radium Hill, Woomera, and elsewhere. And we've got looming battles over the disposal of Australia's existing nuclear waste mostly from Lucas Heights. Another battle looming over AUKUS nuclear waste. And Peter Dutton wants to add high-level nuclear waste from nuclear power to the mix. Some of the media has already provided some useful fact-checking resources. They've gone through Dutton's claims and fact-checked them and found most of them to be nonsense. So I would encourage you to check out these links. I won't go through them here, but they're very useful resources. We've also got the resources up at the Don't Nuke the Climate website. But there's already quite a lot of good fact-checking articles available. More information, Don't Nuke the Climate, FO, ACF, Renew Economy's done a really good job of covering this issue. The ETU, No Future for Nuclear, is a great resource. And finally, I just want to encourage people once again to download this PowerPoint from nuclear.fo.org.au. And I put the link in the chat already. And thanks very much. And I'll hand it back to you, Scott.
Thank you, Jim. That was devastating, terrifying, coherent, appalling. I was a bit on the fence about this issue, and now I'm not. I'm convinced. You wouldn't have seen it, Jim, because you were concentrating, but there's a lot of love for that presentation in the chat. I just want to acknowledge that was not whipped up in an afternoon. There is years and years of work and expertise wrapped up in that. And also you skipped over some of the most terrifying stuff. What keeps me from being depressed when I see that kind of thing is that this is what we're playing for. This is what we can win. We can keep this horrific industry, or that dimension of it at least, off this continent permanently if we work hard in the next 9 months. And these campaigns aren't won by people standing on the sidelines. They're won by people joining calls like this on a Saturday morning and then getting involved. I would now love to introduce our next speaker, who's going to do a bit of show and tell. Sanne Swart is the Nuclear Free Collective Coordinator at Friends of the Earth in Melbourne. She holds a master's degree in peace and conflict studies. She's had the privilege to walk with traditional owners on their country to learn about why they want to keep uranium in the ground. And now, because of this Dutton obscenity, Sanne is full tilt on keeping nuclear power stations off this continent. Sanne, go ahead.
Thanks, Scott. Hey, everyone. I'm calling in from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country here. And so, yeah, I just wanted to show you. Let me share the Don't Nuke the Climate screen with you. So this is the website. The Don't Nuke the Climate Australia is part of a broader global campaign, which is Don't Nuke the Climate International, which is different organizations that have been coordinating around COPs coming up, and the nuclear lobby really ramping up in the climate space, trying to get a piece of the green pie and survive. And so we felt that Australia, with this with nuclear's delusional nuclear dreams, needed some pushback. So we revamped the Don't Nuke the Climate website, really as a resource to really get your fact checking, to compile all the information, because it's so much coming out at the moment. It's a bit overwhelming. So we are selecting the best articles. I'll scroll you to. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, great. Okay. So the Newswire. Like this. There we go. Has all the latest articles, because there is a lot, and just to sift through it. So we've done that for you. We've got some really great people that are really smart and know everything about this, have been studying this for a long time. So you don't have to, if you're new to this space, you don't have to start from scratch. And we really wanted to make like a really accessible platform for people to be able to gather information and do their own dissemination to counter the misinformation that is coming out of Dutton and the coalition and the Murdoch press. It's and everybody else that has stakes in this game. I wanted to show you. Bring that up. Can you see this photo coming up? Yeah. So I thought this was just, there's an analysis that was made kind of predicting if we went by the current plans and if they were adhered to, of course, because we can't let Labour off the hook with all their approving of coal mines and gas projects either. But what it would look like is the first graph if everything goes according to plan in 2050. And if it we would go with the coalition's current we can't even call it plans, but ideas, then it would look a little bit more like the second graph, which is, I think, quite graphic and quite demonstrating of where the interests really lie. So I'm just going to scroll you down. There's a great resources page as well that I'll go into. We've got a part on in whose backyard. Click on that for a second, where we've got the information of which communities are currently affected, but we've also scoped the different organizations, the different communities that have retiring or retired coal power stations in the country. The red dots are the current ones that have been identified for potential nuclear power sites, but that doesn't mean that the other ones are necessarily off the hook if one falls through. So it's good to have that overview. And thanks for Scott for putting it all together. We also have a part here when the different communities that are affected set up their campaigns, and we'll hear a bit more from Wendy in a second. We'll hope to link this to the campaigns that are happening on the ground and really being able to amplify those. I'm going to go back to the home page. There's a great for and against overview, and this is all still preliminary. The website is still being built and perfected as we go, but it just gives a really good overview of like who is on the right side of like the arguments here, and they're all familiar names. And that's not an exhaustive list. We're going to add to that, and the names that are like in favor of nuking the climate, which are very much in line with the same people that are kind of championing the fossil fuels. And it really highlights the interests that are behind this proposal. There's a great part on myth busting as well that Dr. Jim Green has written. So you can find the most common arguments and helps you build your counter argument. So when you're on social media or when you're invited to a panel or when you have the chance to write a letter to your local newspaper or go on local radio to let your voice heard, these are really good resources to use when we go, so that we've got all the information really clear, and we're also aware of what the opposition is saying at the moment. There's a part on small modular reactors, which there's extensive information about this, how it's way too expensive. I hope there's also some information there about how it doesn't only produce a Coke tin full of waste every year, but in fact they produce more waste than the big ones in comparison in scale. And I think the last, so here is this is the newswire. We saw that one. I'll just take you to the resources page for a minute. It's not like we're going to put some nice photos in there later, but it's got all the important reports. So the ACF recently put out this really great report here, and it's got all the gen cost reports, which have got all the numbers. So it's really quite exhaustive, and we will keep contributing to that and adding to that as we go along. So we really encourage you to share this website, use the website. And the last thing I'm going to show you is the Take Action page, which is also still very in its baby steps. But so we encourage you to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, which is the best way to kind of just amplify everything we do. We try to put a post out every day at least. We've got some great videos that were made for COP last year, but that come in really helpful, and they're explainer videos that are really well made that we encourage you to share with everyone as well. We're making a TikTok page at the moment because we're very much aware that the nuclear industry is aiming at younger people that don't have Fukushima and Chernobyl like really present in their memory, and for who are facing a future riddled with climate change, and for whom this might seem like a really golden nugget that the nuclear industry is offering them. So yeah, it's really important to reach out to young people and make sure that they don't get persuaded by these false solutions, which will not help them. It's really replacing one terrible future with another, where there is more friendlier futures out there. The other thing, so the ACF has got a nuclear free an Email the Coalition action up that I encourage you to go to and sign. And Yes to Renewables at Friends of the Earth has got a Gibson Says No to Nuclear petition up as well. And we will keep adding, and I'll put those links in the chat as well. So I'm just gonna stop sharing. Great. And any questions about that, we will share a link to the website in a minute as well. And also, if you use us as a platform as well, so if you're involved in a campaign or if you're doing something locally against this, please let us know. If you've got a petition running, please let us know so that we can put it on our website and we can amplify it as far and wide as we can. That would be really great. So also feel free to put in the chat today if you're doing something, so that we can share that with the follow-up email as well. Okay, that's my bit.
So great, thank you. We're very proud of the site and of all the expertise that's gone into it. I just want to thank everybody who's contributed. There's a ton of stuff there. As you will probably understand from the last 4 presentations, we're not short of facts, we're not short of information, and we're not short of numbers. It's really just about getting organised and making sure that our voices are actually heard over this utterly deranged push, which, as we can see, is a hardcore combination of sabotage and industry self-interest on behalf of mainly foreign overseas nuclear power interests who are absolutely desperate to stay in the game. We're running a little bit ahead of time. I wanted to invite Wendy Farmer, who's community organiser with Yes to Renewables, works with Friends of the Earth, She's also a community advocate with Voices of the Valley. Has been very involved in the Latrobe Valley for many years and is no stranger to industrial disasters. And just figured it might be handy, since Wendy's closer than I am at present to one of the proposed sites of Dutton's nuclear power station. So, Wendy, hopefully you are unmuted and able to let fly. Please go ahead.
I can't unmute.
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, we've got
You can hear me? Okay,
Go
great.
ahead.
It wouldn't let me unmute. Hi, everyone. I actually am just a guest on today, and I wasn't a speaker, so I haven't prepared anything. But I have been very active in the Latrobe Valley region since the announcement. In fact, the day of the announcement, we ran a small rally within hours outside the front of one of our local federal members. Yes, our area has been one of the places, spoken about for nuclear. One of the things I really find surprising is the bullying tactics that the Dutton government has used on communities. In fact, we are going to put a nuclear plant in your region. We will do it, whether we're not going to talk to the company that actually owns a site. If they don't want to give us a site or sell us a site, we will actually just compulsory acquisition the site. Like just things like that. And then to tell the state, well, we can overrule you. And we saw in Jim's presentation that that's true. What I have been doing, and I can't say too much at the moment because it has been a bit delayed, is actually working across Australia with the other regions. We will have an announcement midweek, hopefully Tuesday, Wednesday, an exclusive. But then we want Australians to actually jump on board and support the regions. And the idea is that we support the regions to say no to nuclear. We really, before the mention of nuclear a few months ago, I really hadn't paid much attention to nuclear. My job is in renewable energy, supporting renewable energy, debunking the facts of renewable energy. Although now we're seeing a complete, we have to react to the nuclear story, but also a quick learning curve for me as well. And our community have heard nuclear before, but never thought that it would be possible. I still don't think it would be possible. But what I'm really hearing from my community and communities that I'm working with at the moment is the language we use. The language we use when we talk about nuclear, and that's become really important. You probably noticed I put a little comment on Jim's when Jim was talking about a plan. Dutton doesn't have a plan. So can we not use the word plan? He has a thought, he has an idea, but he doesn't have a plan. So let's make people aware that Dutton doesn't have a plan. No detail has been given. The other thing is when we use the nuclear plants sound good. I love looking at my plants out the front garden. They look fantastic. New flower. Wow. Let's use reactors. Let's use what they are. It's a nuclear facility that will have reactors. What I'm trying to do is actually send a message to our communities to actually think about what they're not opposing if they're not opposing them. Our backyard, we hear all the time with, wind turbines, solar, not in my backyard. Actually, we're asking for the bigger scale of it, not in our regions. No nuclear in our regions. It's not our backyard. It's everybody's backyard. It's our regions. So, it's starting to really work across how we use the language for communities to actually understand. Because if I said not in my backyard, I would have to live within a couple of kilometres of the nuclear reactors. In fact, I'm going to live 30 kilometres from a nuclear reactor. Guess what? The risk to my family is as big as if you live 5 kilometres to a reactor. So we don't want that in our community. Jim, I thought some of your stuff was brilliant, and I'm going to have to reach out to you and see how I can use it better. There was one other thing. One thing I have been asked, so I don't know if there's people from Gippsland on this call. If there is, please reach out to me because we will be running another rally. We have been working with the unions, a whole range of different people to actually really address this thing across Dave, you know, Jim, Sanne, like heaps of different people, all the different regions. But Latrobe Valley will run another rally in a couple of weeks. So if you are in our region, I'm going to give you a call out now to actually support us. If you want to come down for a holiday, support us. We haven't got a date, but we need to make sure we're clear that we will not accept nuclear reactors in our own regions. And just one last point, one of the really big things, and, you know, Jim, or when we talk about, and Dave, when we talk about nuclear reactors, people say to me, we're regions that need jobs. We need jobs. We desperately need jobs. Don't stop nuclear because we need jobs. So we need to start talking about when the jobs would be. If it was AGL's site in Loy Yang, 2035 is when they're proposing to close, or that's their closure date. They still have to rehabilitate the mine, which is a massive hole that they still wouldn't know how to fill. So the jobs wouldn't be till after 2050. So when we talk about with acting on climate, let's talk about the jobs wouldn't be until after. Let's get some evidence of when the jobs will be, because that's what people in regions are clinging to. We need the jobs. You know, I've seen people in WA on here, and, you know, that's a desperate call there. We need the jobs. South Australia, we need the jobs. So let's start showing that the jobs won't be available. That's all.
Thanks so much, Wendy. That's awesome. Thank you for bringing the fire. I feel like we've moved from assessing the threat to starting to counter it. And so let's continue in that spirit. But that was magnificent, Wendy. I really appreciate it, especially that we put you on the spot with no opportunity to prepare. So we got the chat is positively fizzing with ideas and suggestions and proposals. And let's keep it going. We've got a little bit longer together. So I'm going to just take a couple of questions. Then we're going to do a bit of a wrap up, and we've got, as you could imagine, some ideas for next steps. There's a question here really about the politics of it. Jill put this in a little while ago in the chat. Don't you think that Dutton has wedged elbow on nukes because of his acceptance via AUKUS of nuclear subs? And we've seen the two issues being conflated somewhat. As seen in Albanese government's attention to focusing on costs rather than safety and waste issues of nuclear technology. I'm going to make this one opt-in. Would any of our speakers like to grab that one, the conflation of the weapons and the power issue?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a first crack at that one, Scott, and thanks for the folks that have raised that. And it's a tragic flaw of the Albanese government that they signed off with so little scrutiny, so little evidence, and so little public information on AUKUS. I noticed in the chat that I think it was Noel put forward the theory of they were scared of being wedged, being soft on defence, and that is my understanding of absolutely the case. You know, this was highly political. It was dropped out in September 2021 by surprise. First anybody knew about it was that weird three-way media conference, and Labor had a day, were given a day, and they chose those writing instructions to make a decision, and they decided to neutralise defence as an election issue by saying yes to AUKUS. An appalling decision. Which will have long-term negative implications for Australia. And since they became in government, they've continued to actively advance AUKUS. At opportunities when they could have walked it back, they've walked it forward. So it's a real problem. A couple of things in relation to the domestic nuclear debate and the current spot we find ourselves in was really interesting that at the time that AUKUS was announced, the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison was at pains to say that this was not related to civil nuclear power, that it was not a precursor to civil nuclear power, or not a precursor to Australia embracing or facilitating nuclear weapons. So I viewed that at the time as a tribute to the sustained work by many people over many years that have made nuclear power and nuclear weapons very much a bridge too far, that he had to actively and consistently say that this was not related to, not dependent on, and not a forerunner to. But we've seen now In the same way as the coalition has pivoted from your consent is essential to your consent doesn't matter, in the same way that the coalition has pivoted from small modular reactors only. Dutton said 2 years ago he didn't agree with large reactors. Now they're the whole, basis of his illusion. In that same way, that AUKUS is now being used as both a justification, a driver, and a legitimizer of all things nuclear. We're hearing, we've got these small reactors in our subs. What's wrong with them having them on land? Labor's okay with our sailors facing this risk, so therefore there can be no risk. These things are safe. They're saying they're now using this politically and saying, well, what about waste? I saw a press conference recently where Dutton was asked about waste, and he said, well, ask that. You better direct that question to Richard Marles. He's looking at that question now in relation to AUKUS waste. So they're using this as a political construct to wedge, to neutralise, to sort of show that Labor is doing a little bit of theatre about domestic nuclear because deep down they support nuclear. Look at AUKUS. So it is a real problem. Labor has to navigate this strange space between being supportive on one hand of AUKUS and seeing it as fundamental to Australia's defence and future, and on the other hand saying that nuclear has no role and is no basis for Australia's energy future. That has constrained Labor, and you can see that, as I noticed someone said in the chat, in relation to the focus on cost. Like, cost is a legitimate issue in anything, but any of our energy options for replacing coal are going to cost. Anything is going to be big ticket. Renewables will cost, nuclear will cost twice as much or more, but Labor's focus on that, as opposed to safety, as opposed to waste, as opposed to all the other issues, is trying to reduce this into cost of living economic management frame, which is one they want to isolate themselves from concerns on considerations and allegations of hypocrisy and inconsistency over AUKUS. I think for us, we need to be really clear, and we fight each fight on its merits. We say that Labor made a great mistake signing off on AUKUS, continues to make a great mistake advancing it uncritically. AUKUS is increasingly under pressure and unlikely to deliver. And Labor's also making a great mistake pushing forward to try and sort rapidly, cauterise a site for managing AUKUS waste. All those things said, Labor has a clear position on domestic nuclear power, which is opposed, that domestic nuclear power has no role. And I think it's quite possible for us as nuclear-free activists to say Labor's got it wrong on AUKUS, Labor's got it right on domestic nuclear power. And we don't have to play that politics, we just play the reality of a positioning on each issue. That's what would my advice, and that's the position that ACF and others will be taking. AUKUS is dangerous and deficient, but it shouldn't be an enabler and an opener to all sorts of other nuclear adventurism and risk. And I think the other thing in this debate too, that these people are never satisfied. They're never happy, and some sort of politics of appeasement is not going to work. Scott said we have an opportunity to knock this out of the park and to get into a genuine, serious conversation about energy futures, and that's what we need to do. Because Peter Dutton says we've got a third of the world's uranium. Yes, we do, and a great credit to all of us and all that came before us that there's only two operating mines. But he says that as if we've got a third of the world's uranium, why don't we use it here for nuclear power? As if you just dry it out, put it for half an hour in the sun and then chuck it in a reactor and you use it. As if there isn't fuel fabrication, enrichment, all sorts of industrial processes that go beforehand. Every step of this nuclear push is a step to open more. We've already seen Alexander Downer say we should store the world's radioactive waste. The fight that many of us on this call and many of us fought and won in mid-last decade in South Australia, and 2 decades before that in Western Australia with Pangaea. So if we allow, or if a better way to put it, the coalition is successful in advancing nuclear and normalising nuclear in Australia. They will not stop. They'll go for full cycle. They'll go for international radioactive waste, and it will become more and more this dystopian nightmare. So we need to call it for what it is, criticise Labor for AUKUS, but actually support Labor's position and the Greens' position and the Teals' position and most of the crossbenchers' position on domestic nuclear, and keep it clear and simple and not play the confusion or hypocrisy game and just say, Labor's got it wrong on one, you've got it wrong on all, coalition.
And in a nutshell, I'm going to throw to Jim. Thanks, Dave. I'm going to throw to Jim in a second. There's a great question that Buzz put in the chat. I just want to go directly to one that Wendy asked just now. I've just thrown a link in the chat about the health impacts. It is an issue that's been somewhat downplayed. We're talking a lot about costs, about politics, about the timing, about the greenhouse, because that's kind of where the debate's gone to. But I've just thrown a link to an excellent kind of meta-analysis on the health impacts of occupational environmental exposures to nuclear power plants. Now, this is not a study, it's a study of studies. So they've looked at dozens of epidemiological studies going back many, many years. And this does not relate to Fukushima or Chernobyl or catastrophic meltdowns or core melts. This is the normal, regulatorily compliant operation of nuclear power stations emit chronic low doses of radioactive materials, very small amounts of very dangerous carcinogenic chemicals. Take a look at that link. That should be the end of the argument by itself. That should have meant we didn't need to get on this call. The fact that if you live not 5 kilometres, 30 kilometres, as Wendy said, or further downwind or downstream of these plants, elevated incidence of various kinds of cancer, mesothelioma for the workforce, that should be the end of the story. Anyway, take a look at that. It'll make your hair stand on end. Buzz asked, and I've just got to scroll back. I've officially lost control of the chat because there's so many questions and good ideas in there. Buzz asked a little time ago, what do we do about the media and the fact that it's not really engaging with the fact that other much lower cost and lower risk technologies are out there? And Jim, I thought I might throw to you on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Well, first, can I give a bit of perspective? Until recently, I was thinking that Dutton's nuclear power plans, if we can call it a plan, is stupid and counterproductive and is bound to fail. And that's still a definite possibility, but I'm getting more and more nervous, and there are two reasons for that. One is that inflation kills governments, and inflation could kill the Albanese Labor government, and we could have Peter Dutton as Prime Minister this time next year, and he will claim a mandate to move ahead with nuclear power and also to derail the renewable energy transition. The other reason that I'm nervous is that every day I do a Google search to see how this nuclear power debate is unfolding. And that makes me nervous because every day there's a mountain of pro-nuclear propaganda, everything from articles to opinion pieces to videos to memes. They're very well resourced and they're very organised, and I think they've been quite effective. And we can't possibly hope to compete with that organised, well-funded pro-nuclear movement, but we need to do our very best to counter it. So that being the case, I would ask everyone to think of how you can contribute to this campaign. That might be talking to friends and family and colleagues and explaining the facts to them and countering their arguments, familiarising yourself with the fact-checking resources that I pointed to earlier. It might be writing letters to editors, to the newspapers, and I think that's a very effective strategy. And someone noted that Robin Wood here in Adelaide is doing an excellent job getting multiple letters into the Advertiser. It's a really good idea. And once you get familiar and confident doing that, you can do it quickly and effectively. And if anyone would like an info sheet on how to write letters to the editor and how to get them published, send me an email and I'll send that info sheet to you. I'm just putting my email in the chat here. Writing opinion pieces, if that's something that you can do or you're interested in learning how to do, that can be very effective. It's very difficult to get them in the mainstream newspapers, but it's much easier to get them in online publications. And once again, if you'd like to do that, I can send you an info sheet on how to write effective opinion pieces and how to get them published. Beyond that, of course, there's social media, and we need to fight this debate in social media as elsewhere. And as I've alluded to, there is a downside here, which is that we have Prime Minister Dutton 12 months from now with a mandate to push ahead with nuclear power and a mandate to completely derail the renewable energy transition. But the upside is that if we can defeat this, it will set back the nuclear power lobby by a generation. We won't hear from them for 20 years in any meaningful sense. And it means we can get on with the serious business of this renewable energy transition. And it's achievable, it's doable. And I would encourage people to read what Matt Keane has been saying, the former New South Wales Deputy Premier. He puts these arguments very well. There is a glittering prize at the end of this rainbow, which is a low carbon, affordable energy system. It's within reach. It's not going to be simple or straightforward or as cheap as we'd like it to be, but it is doable. And we need to make sure that that happens. And to that end, I would once again encourage everyone to get active in whatever way you feel you can best contribute to making this a reality. And I'll leave it there, Scott.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. We will save the chat from this. It's moving too fast for me to keep track of while I'm trying to keep track of the speakers. But on the subject that Jim has just touched on there, and that another, who was it in the chat? I kind of love that we're just completely losing control of it. It's moving too quick. Noel pointed out Atlas Network's think tanks. I want to throw two quick links into the chat for people who want to know what that's about, because it goes to, like, what is the source of this media disinformation? The garbage that you read in the Australian or the Daily Telegraph, like, where are these fake studies coming from? So two links to throw in. This is really lovely work that's going on in the Fifth Estate at the moment by a fellow called Murray Hogarth. Very well credentialed and just really detailed look at what are the industry links and what are the links between the industry, the political tier, and the disinformation in the media. It's called the Nuclear Files. It goes into quite a bit of depth about the Westinghouse tie-up, about exactly how Dutton has been doing this stuff and the role of the think tanks, particularly the Institute of Public Affairs, who I suspect many people on this call will have heard of. And if you want to know more about the network itself, where it comes from and why it is behaving the way it is on behalf of fossil fuel interests, a colleague of mine, Dr. Jeremy Walker, I've just thrown his ResearchGate link into the chat as well. For 3 or 4 of the major think tanks that are active in Australia at pumping disinfo into the public discourse, into friendly media channels, Murdoch and other, Centre for Independent Studies, the Institute of Public Affairs, Advance, who are more of an attack dog than a think tank, and CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, I think they call themselves, which is US Republican aligned. All 4 of those have spun up pro-nuclear campaigns within the last 12 months, some of them spending quite significant amounts of money to poison the information well. The only way that we can fight that is by looking out for each other, spotting the stuff when you see it at source, and countering it with the kind of material that we've provided today, and call it out. So we've got time, I reckon, for a couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap up with some next steps. Con had a question about decommissioning, which is not a subject that I think Dutton would be very interested in engaging with. What happens when a nuclear power plant, reaches the end of its life? What do you do with it? Who feels like having a strong opinion on that one?
Well, I'll answer that just briefly, Scott. I think there have been 3 eras of the nuclear industry. There was the growth era, and there was the era of nuclear stagnation, which has been the past 30 years. And now we're just entering the era of nuclear decline. And this is where this problem of decommissioning and waste management starts to come into focus, because they can no longer push it into the long grass. There are more reactors being decommissioned, and there's more waste that no one wants to deal with. And of course, they're finding that decommissioning is much more expensive than they had initially imagined, typically in the hundreds of millions of dollars per power plant. And of course, there's this problem that no one knows what to do with the high-level nuclear waste. No one's come up with a better, more practical idea other than to dig a deep hole underground and to bury the waste. And no country has got an operating dump for high-level nuclear waste. Finland and Sweden are constructing such deep underground repositories, but they're not yet operating. And I mentioned that there is one deep underground dump for intermediate level waste. It's in the United States. It was very badly mismanaged and under-regulated, resulting in a number of accidents, including a chemical explosion in an underground nuclear waste barrel in 2014, which closed it down for 3 years and cost $2 to $3 billion to clean up. So, you know, that's the world's experience with deep underground dumps. There's one, and it's in the United States, and it's already suffered an explosion. I'll leave it there, Scott.
Thanks, Jim. Cheerful as hell. We're going to take one or two more questions, and then we're going to launch ourselves into this campaign. There's one, is it going to kind of be a combo of what Margie put in the chat and one by Nick about the public nature, the subsidies, where the money is actually going to come from, and insurance. Does anybody want to just speak on that one briefly? Is it even plausible to get commercial insurance of any kind for a nuclear power plant or your house if you're downstream? But how come all these free marketers are suddenly so keen on state funding for nuclear power?
Well,
Yeah, you go, Jim.
Okay, I'll take the insurance one. No, you can't insure yourself against a nuclear accident. So the government would have to provide that sort of liability. And we had this debate in relation to the replacement of the nuclear research reactor at Lucas Heights. And basically the debate was around whether the government would provide a full indemnity or whether there would be a limited indemnity, in which case anyone who suffered losses as a result of a nuclear accident would have to sue the Commonwealth government, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's essentially a David and Goliath battle if an individual or a household has to sue the federal government. You're unlikely to win that. It's very unfair. So basically, you should assume that you can't get commercial insurance. And if you suffer losses, you're going to have to sue the Commonwealth government, in which case, good luck. You're not likely to win. This whole issue of government ownership of nuclear plants, it's really interesting because, you know, a big problem in the whole electricity sector was the privatization of the electricity sector that caused enormous problems and continues to do so. So I don't think reasserting government control over the energy sector is inherently problematic. I think the problem is that Dutton plans to have government control and ownership of nuclear reactors, which we don't need, and which will at very best slow the energy transition and make it more expensive and more dangerous. And of course, it's wrapped up in a broader policy to completely derail the renewable energy transition. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Dave, Sweeney, did you want to add?
No, you've pretty comprehensively done it. I think the key thing, though, I think, and a really important thing for people to know, and particularly picking up on Wendy's concerns about people in the community, you know, the jobs and health issue, but that, you know, the single biggest asset that most working people have in their life, if they have it, is a house, and you can't insure your house from nuclear contamination and nuclear accidents. So I think that's a really important point. Insurance companies deal and defray lots of risks and lots of costs, and they've all got a position that you cannot insure against radiological fallout or impacts. So that speaks volumes. I think internationally too, it's also really interesting to see that that there are very many. They're different in how they are actually structured, but they're all the same in their intent, which is to defray and cap and protect nuclear utilities from insurance claims. In the US, which is the largest of the nuclear, the most reactors, the largest fleet, the only way that those reactors operate is a piece of legislation long-standing called the Price-Anderson Act, which caps their liability in the event of an accident. And every other liability after a small cap becomes the federal government's cost. And what we're seeing here, and I agree with Jim, I don't have a problem per se in public ownership. I'm a fan as a rule, but I'm not a fan of public ownership is being used because the item or industry in question has utterly failed to convince anyone else that it's a good idea, credible, or can stand on its own feet. So I'm not a fan of using public money to prop up private or political benefit in a plan that has no public benefit. And that's what I see is being used here. This free market party is adopting sort of Stalinist-style economic approaches to cover up the fact that this industry, the nuclear industry, is profoundly underperforming, and the market has looked at it, whether they generate electricity, transmit electricity, or fund electricity. All of those institutions in Australia are either deeply suspicious of or actively hostile to nuclear. And there's no role then to use our dollars, our tax dollars, our future to bankroll something that has so utterly failed and is so utterly unnecessary.
Tell us what you really reckon, though. It was pretty ambiguous. Folks, we're going to land this one on time because I know everybody's got a lot to do. And so we're going to go for a couple of announcements. I'm going to invite our main speakers, like a 30-second last words, last thoughts. We've captured a lot of questions and a lot of suggestions, actually, and some advice and good thoughts. We've been grabbing those, even if we haven't addressed them directly on the call. They've been grabbed. None of those great ideas have been lost. And so we'll get back to you on some of these suggestions, some of which are actionable straight away. And there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to as well. I just want to do a quick save the date for the 3rd of August. If everybody on this call were to bring 10 friends on the 3rd of August, we'd have 600 people on the call. And that's the kind of scaling that we're going to need. Oh, hello, got a little wave. That's the kind of scaling that we're going to need so that we've got 6,000 on the call after that. And that this venture of Dutton's and his creepy mates turns into a full-scale face plant that will be recalled anytime in any future election campaign somebody brings up nuclear. The cautionary tale will be, well, you know what happened when Peter Dutton tried that. That's our job. The speakers today have given us a really great overview and oversight as to the sort of machine that we're up against. We've shown in this country and around the world time and again that we're up to it, that we can beat these people, but it's going to take quite a bit of work. And the payoff is that we clear this enormous toxic obstacle to the renewable revolution, which is well underway. We clear that out of the way and we can just get on with it. And I reckon that's a lot to play for. Getting nuclear out of the road in the next 8 or 9 months will be a disaster for the gas industry and it'll be a disaster for the coal industry. That's what we're on about. That's why we've convened this morning. That's what we're going to be talking about on the 3rd of August. There'll be a lot more speakers. There'll be a lot more to tell, but what we really need is to build this crowd. So August 3, save the date. You've all been invited to follow the Don't Nuke the Climate socials, the stuff that ACF, FO and other allies and for other crew are putting out. So when you see that, please help us amplify that. And I reckon that's it in terms of housekeeping. I might just invite our speakers, maybe in the order in which we called you up, another 30 or 40 seconds, final thoughts, things to send crew on our way, and then we can get on with a weekend of organising and maybe even some rest. Dave.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thanks everybody for your attendance today and your effort over many years. And I'll be presumptive enough to say, yeah, elevated effort in the months ahead. One of the things that's come through lots of times is that in a world of lots of diverse information sources and all that sort of stuff, the one that cuts through for people is personal contact, hearing directly from someone they trust about an issue. And so you are all connected people in your community. You are all thoughtful and active, and your voice is so important. I think it's really important to know that a lot of the pro-nuclear side try and turn this into an intensely arcane rabbit hole technical discussion. And there are real technical issues, but they're dealt with. Like if you download Jim's slide deck, his presentation, which was excellent, and if you have some time to just work through some of those links, it makes a compelling intellectual case that this is a really bad idea. But I think we don't need to get caught in the techie weeds, because this is a values choice. Like, what sort of future do we want? Do we want one that puts a burden of radioactive waste, or we want one that's clean and natural renewable energy systems? So I think just refreshing yourself or making yourself comfortable with some of the information, but not being too caught up on every last little bit of detail, and having that personal contact and advocacy is really important. And I just finished by saying that, you know, for a lot of us, this nuclear issue, it's been around forever. Like, radioactive waste lasts an eternity, but the run-in to the next election, which is critical, does not. It's a lot quicker than eternity. So if we can regroup, refocus, and elevate and say, for 9-10 months, we're going to make a real charge, so that we're not for 9-10 decades or centuries or eons ruining the result, is critical. And I just finished by a saying that I heard once, which has stuck in me. And it's about, people go, oh, it's too far now, genie in bottle, AUKUS, this and that. Well, the Stone Age didn't end because we run out of stones. And the nuclear age won't end because we run out of nuclear or because we de-invent the technology. It'll end because people like those of us on this call make a measured, considered, responsible decision to choose another path. Australia's got heaps of asbestos. Asbestos works as a, you know, as an insulating thing. It has a high social, a human, environmental cost. We made a choice to leave it in the ground. And that's a good model for our choice as a responsible nation in relation to nuclear technology. And we are critical in bringing this message home over the next 9 months. And I look forward to working with you for that.
Good. Thanks heaps, Dave. Mia, have we still got you on the call?
Yep, I'm still here. Thanks,
You are
everyone.
still here.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Scott. And thanks, everyone on the call. I'm going to make a pitch to all the Westies on the call, and there's lots of really great Westies I can see on here, and many of the good folks at Nuclear Free WA, like KA and Giz and Liam and Joe Val. Thanks for being on this call. Let's regroup, let's catch up, let's get working. For any Westies on here that aren't already part of Nuclear Free WA, I'm just putting a link in the chat. You can sign up there. And for folks around the country, we've just got some great new merch, thanks to Scott Ludlam's redesign of our logo. If you want to grab a hoodie or a t-shirt and wear the big anti-nuke sign loud and proud, you can grab one from our online shop. Sorry for a sales pitch, but yeah, you can grab one there. And thanks everyone for making this happen today. Sanne and Scott for all work on the website, and Jim for all that amazing knowledge and making it accessible. Thank you.
Good bunch, isn't it? Thanks, Mia. Sales pitches, welcome. Jim.
Yeah, I just want to say that the Beyond Nuclear email list is a really important central organising resource for our movement, and has been for the past 15 years or so. It's the main national anti-nuclear email list. It's pretty low volume, and you can also get a daily digest, so you're not getting bombarded by each individual email. So it's user-friendly and it's important. So if you're not already on the Beyond Nuclear email list, just send me an email or put your email in the chat. I'm just putting my email in the chat now if you want to reach out to me. And other than that, thanks very much, Sanne and Scott and Mia and Dave for organising, and thanks everyone else for participating.
Good. Thanks heaps, Jim. I do believe we're going to land this thing right on time. Sanne, some peaceful truth bombs to take us out.
I'll keep it short. Yeah, thanks everyone. This was so good. I will send out a follow-up email with all the information from the chat and a link to the 3rd of August event. So that will be coming up. Please feel free to contact me as well with any quotes you have, any stuff or memes, anything that you think should be on the website. That would be really welcome. And I just want to finish with where Dutton and the pro-nuke bros are really focused on the technical reactor part of it. Just keep in mind that it's part of a broader chain, and that at the beginning and the end of the chain, it's the First Nations communities and frontline communities that are disproportionately affected. I think in this time, it's super important to listen to the communities affected and to the First Nations voices on this issue. So I'll put a link in the chat about the Aboriginal-led Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. They're doing some great work speaking out about this, and also how they are affected by mining and waste dump proposals. I think it's important in this debate that we need to center First Nations voices. So thanks everyone, and we'll be in touch.
Perfectly put. Thanks, Sanne, and thanks to all the speakers. It's been an absolute joy, and knowing many of the people who are on this call are the best example that we could possibly have, really, of why this work is important and necessary. People on this call, by and large, are the reason that there's no national nuclear waste dump in this country, the reason why there's no uranium mine at Jabiluka, the reason why Australia thus far is slowly turning the ship to become an important part of the movement globally, diplomatically, to ban nuclear weapons. And that at no time, despite some pretty disastrous attempts, at no time has anybody managed to build a nuclear power station in this country, is because of this kind of work, these kind of meetings. We're raggedy, but we're ready. I truly believe we can do this. So we'll see you on the next call. Save the date, August 3. And all right, go and do something a bit different. Go and get outside. Hug your dog. And we'll see you on the next one.